The scripture reading today is from Romans 10:5-15. Moses writes this about the righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, "Do not say in your heart, 'Who will ascend into heaven?' That is, to bring Christ down. Or, 'Who will descend into the deep?' That is, to bring Christ up from the dead." But what does it say? The word is near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. If you declare with your mouth, "Jesus is Lord," and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord for all, and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news."
If you notice, I'm not wearing any shoes today. I actually don't wear shoes quite a lot in church because the message, take your shoes from which you stand, for this is holy ground. So whenever I'm in a church, I try to make sure that I don't have my shoes on so that I'm closest to the holy ground as possible. It's a strange thing I do. I do use the claim that I'm a Queenslander, but it's not just because I'm a Queenslander. Jesus was the master of storytelling. He'd say, "Hey, have you heard the story of?" And then go on to talk about the most strangest of things, be it a seed or a sheep or, my favourite, a pearl. Thinking it through, the Bible shows that storytelling was Jesus' go-to method when speaking to the crowd. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. That's Matthew 13. There are many benefits to using stories to communicate spiritual truths. Now, I'm not just going on about this because I'm an author and I like storytelling. There is actually method to our madness when we tell stories. Stories hold our attention. The reason television became so popular before was because it was essentially telling a story with the visuals. Whether you're watching comedy, drama, news, or talk shows, there's always a story, there's always a truth behind each story that you're watching. Some good, some bad. Stories stir our emotion. If you want to change lives, you must craft the message for impact. That's one thing that you learn when you're writing stories, is what's the message behind the story. And lastly, and this is something that Andrew has spoken on, for the Old Testament, stories help us to remember. So most of the Old Testament was written later on because it was told by stories and handed down from generation to generation with the stories. But it's fascinating to watch how quickly a crowd or a person tunes out whenever a story finishes. That story's done, what's the next one? Let's rewind. Whenever a speaker begins telling a story, my first image was people with children coming in closer, crossing their legs and listening so intently. But as soon as the story's done, it's time to go on to the next chapter. The attention quickly vanishes soon after. As people of God, we are a storytelling people. From the very beginning, God's story has been told, reminding us of the riches and the promises from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Even the New Testament was told by stories, and they were written down for us after time. But, and this is the part that I'm getting to, how often do we tell God's story? How often do we tell God's story? And I'm not just talking about a Sunday morning or a Sunday afternoon. But I'm also not just talking about the stories in this. How often do we tell God's story of what's happening now? Our faith journey, our story. The title of the sermon today is Tell My Story. Tell your story. So my story starts when I was a child. It's a sad one, but a funny one at the same time. I grew up in the Catholic Church, and it was a very strict Catholic church. I was a very curious person. I still am a very curious person. And I would always ask questions, and my questions would always be too hard or curly or just something that just shouldn't be answered or questioned, like lesbians, gays, those sorts of things. You don't mention that in the Sunday school at my age. You're not allowed to. The problem was my family, well, my mum and dad were very much a perception people. They don't want anyone to make them look like we don't have our stuff together at home. So me asking all of these curly questions, they're like, what are they teaching this person at home? So I'd get in trouble when I got home because I'd ask all of these questions. And it was innocent questions because I just wanted to know. Growing up, that my attitudes changed to that one. But I got to age 7. I was sitting outside the Catholic doors of the church. And I remember staring at those doors and saying, I can't do it. I can't go into that church and just listen to what you have to say and not ask questions. It's not a case of whatever's in the Bible has to be true. I need to understand it. I can't do it. I don't know what to believe. I can't believe. And it was such a scary moment for me because I was potentially defying God and defying the church and defying my parents, because if I didn't go into that church, I'm going to be that naughty little girl who didn't go inside. And a man appeared to me when I said, I don't know what to believe, and he said, what do you want to believe? It scared me to no end. And I was frightened, and I said, who the hell are you? And yes, I used those words. I was Catholic, but I did use those words. And he said, I'm the man you're talking about. I'm the man you're learning about. And I'm here to answer your questions. I didn't know then that that was a gift. I just knew that Jesus was here and I could ask him any question I wanted. And I asked him all the curly questions. And sometimes I got the answer in strange answers. Sometimes I got it very direct and saying, no, that's not what happened. But it helped me to understand and it helped me to grow my faith. Later on, so I've always had that gift, being able to see spirits. I don't advertise it a lot because that gift comes with a cost. But when it happens, like when something great happens, who do you tell? I was 7 years old and seeing a man that apparently doesn't exist. Not anyone else could see him. And it was very difficult to tell those stories. Growing up, I had that gift and I met other friends along the way, because when you see good spirits, you see the bad ones as well. And I used that gift for good as much as I could. But who do you tell? Do you tell your closest friend that you see dead people? Because are they dead? I don't know. It's difficult to sit down and have a conversation with somebody. And the part that I remember so strongly, I was having an argument with Andrew, and I was having an argument in my head. And he was standing in the room, and I was talking to Andrew in the bed, and then Andrew got to a point, and I told him to this side, not where Andrew was, and I said, I'll tell him in a minute. And Andrew's like, who are you talking to? And he kind of looked at me like I was a crazy person. But when I told him, because we'd been married for a long time, and eventually I told him, and the relationship changed a bit because I was honest with him from then on. Whenever I did something random, I didn't just randomly go out to the shops and not tell him where I went. I actually said, God sent me out to the shops, I needed to go and help somebody. It changed a lot because I was able to talk to somebody about my story. The church is designed to listen and to be open to these kinds of things because God is active in the community today. He does things in your life every day. But how often have you told your story in the community? Your story can have a big impact on someone else. Having a cup of coffee and talking about your story to a friend, a neighbour who's known you for so long but hasn't really known you can help them to understand and know who God is, because you will always understand God differently to the person next to you. Our relationships are different. How we relate to everyone is different. I relate to each of my children differently, so God would relate differently to each one. I love listening to people's stories. I love it when it's random. When we were going to I'm not sure if you guys know this, it's the Bible shop in Devonport. I was going in there, I was talking to him about what had happened this week, and the shopkeeper told me all his stories, and this was the most uplifting moment of my day. I was just going down to pick up something that had scripture on it as a gift, and he told me his story about when he went to a wedding. And I'm like, this is amazing. Why don't we do this more often? Why don't we talk about what God's doing now? I mean, we've all read the stories, we know what happens then, but what happens now? God's story is begging to be told. Your story needs to be told. Not just by me or Andrew or a guest speaker who comes in, but each and every one of us needs to tell our story. Especially when we've changed and been saved. We don't know. I didn't know that my son had been saved. So I just remember hearing it from somebody else and saying, hey, by the way, your son's been saved. I'm like, that would have been nice to know. He wants you to go out and tell your story. Not just here. Not just here. I want to hear your stories. I do. I would love to hear your stories. Even if you just call me up and let me know, it's like, hey, this is what's happened. And I'd be like, great. God's acting in the community and it's great. But he wants to hear other people. He wants to get his word, his message, his actions out into the community as much as possible. So this week, I'm encouraging all of you to tell not just his story in the Bible. I love hearing the verses. I love hearing the stories about that. But a lot of people will tune out because they're like, yes, it's the Christmas story. We've heard it all before. What's he doing now in your life? Get it out there. Tell the world what your story is. Okay? Can we do that? Not just to me. I want to hear your stories too, but yes, I'm getting thumbs up. I love thumbs up. All right.